Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you very warmly to this event. It's the first event in a row of two events. I will say some words to that now. My name is Robert Huber, as Helena mentioned. I welcome you on behalf of Zukunftsgeräusche GbR, which is the organizer of the event. I was organizing the event together with Helena, and I'm very happy that so many people found the way to our discussion tonight. I also want to welcome you on behalf of the Agency for Citizenship Education, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, as it's called in German. We are very happy that they support this event, and I also want to introduce some more partners. First of all, the Senate of Berlin, the Czech Centers, the Prague Institute of Planning and Development, and the City Civic Education Center of Prague.
Good evening, and it's a big pleasure for me to welcome you also in the name of Czech Centers. And as you notice, we are in the center of Prague, and we are also in the Czech Center. So it's, I think it's the right spot for the discussion about city centers tonight.
So thank you, Robert Huber and Mrs. Stepanova. I'm also very honored to be able to moderate this discussion tonight with so many interesting guests and interesting personalities. I'm also very glad that we attracted such an attention of broad general public and to see so many friendly faces in the audience. Tonight we are actually launching an experimental format. The architecture historian and film fan Tanja Scheffler, she curated a film selection from Czech and Berlin or Czech and German films, and we will be screening these short sequences as an inspiration for the debate. The overall topic, as it was mentioned, is living and inhabiting the city centers in the perspective of the last 25 years. Our guests are important actors in both Prague and Berlin, being in politics, architecture, and culture. The majority of them is actually also active in the public scene. For example, in architectural festivals, political parties, or citizen-led campaigns and initiatives. Throughout the discussion, we would like to hear their personal stories, how they're connected to the city they are living in, and in the more complex, on the more complex level, we would like to talk about strategies, how to make our cities more habitable in terms of housing, more socially and functionally diverse, and also more creative.
I'm not living in Prague for 25 years. I come actually from northern part of Bohemia, from a city of Teplice, which is near the border with the Bundesrepublik Deutschland today. First time as I really spent the time in Prague, it was during my studies. I first studied history, and it's like here, nearby, at the Charles University next door. Those days in the late 90s, the city was awaking. Today, I think we can see the change because the very center of the city in some parts is more or less a Disneyland. It's no more a heritage. It started to be a heritage Disneyland. It's something which is maybe covered, where the image of the city is covered sometimes by the people selling the goods. So I think that's if we are speaking about the center of the city. So when we've decided to move to Prague, we were looking for another Prague. And we have found it in Prague 7, which is very near to where we are today. It's a left bank of the river. And it reminds me to the northern part of Bohemia, to Teplice and to industry which is there, because Holešovice and Prague 7, there are a lot of pieces of industry which are there up to date. and they are making landmarks. There is a lot of free space, and because we are speaking about Berlin also today, it reminds me Berlin, because in the center of Berlin there's up today really a lot of space which can be seen as an opportunity, as something which could be developed not by some developers, but which could change in a very meaningful space, which can make a new life, which can help us to build a new center of the city. I'm not sure whether this is possible in the very historical center of Prague where we are today. So, according to me, the center of Prague is today very touristic and it changed a lot. I don't have this feeling in Berlin.
Thank you. Mr. Kühne.
I started as a small town boy. I grew up in the very west of Germany, near the French border, and in an industrialized area, coal mining and steel factoring area, where there was no historic city and no big cities. Everybody lived in small houses, and so one of the first bigger cities I visited in my school days was the city of Prague. At that time, school boys and schoolgirls from West Germany went to Prague to see a real historic city, because you don't have that in Germany. All the historic centers are bombed away. You have some reconstructions. My grandparents lived in Nuremberg. That's a historic city that is a reproduction of the 1950s. That was in 1975, and 1 year later we also visited the city of Berlin. As a small town boy, I wanted, and who studied architecture, I wanted to go to a big city to learn what a big city could be. And I went to West Berlin. At that time we were not allowed to enter a university in East Berlin. We had very special conditions, and for a young guy who didn't really know what a big city is, who didn't really know what urban planning is, and who didn't really know what architecture is, West Berlin was a paradise, because you had a lot of remainings from a former big city, and you had a disappeared city, and that was an extreme option for imagination. People like me learned and tried to learn what can be a big city, and how it is possible that it can disappear in one generation. And these Potsdamer Platz walks, that were our Sunday, weekend or evening walks, and we did exactly the same. We asked, where is Potsdamer Platz? Why did it disappear? And is it an option under circumstances when everybody expected we will never experience reunification in our lifetimes? Is it an option to revitalize, to restart urban life in the sandy deserts of the former city center of Berlin? And so the imagination of big cities and the experience, they can disappear, and they have to be saved. They have to be saved. At that time, Prague was hidden beauty. Everything was gray, and you didn't know which palace should collapse in the year to come. And you had the experience of Berlin where the city had already disappeared. That was two major experiences in my student times. And of course, and my generation as architects in West Germany, we heard every day at the university, stop studying architecture, you will be unemployed. And when we started to be unemployed, the wall came down and we had something to do. And then, not only for my profession, but from many people who had this imagination of a lost city, even of a lost continent, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, they tried to imagine and to experience what could be the next step without clear circumstances, without a clear political basis, and without a clear economical basis. And so Central Europe, the eastern part of Central Europe and Berlin was a paradise for young people like me. And now we have different experience for 25 years and also extremely touristic ones in Berlin, but maybe I come to that a little bit later.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Melkova.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm a good example of changes in living, because my way of living is a little bit conservative, I could say, because I was born in Prague. I'm still living in the same part of Prague, or majority of my life. I'm living at Vinohrady, which is could be said wider center of Prague. And what I like there is that this part of Prague not changed so much in last years. And what changed really is not the structure of the city. Houses were renovated, public space was renovated, but what really changed is the way of life, which I could say this is a part of Prague where really many foreigners are living. And when they came, I think they started to learn, Prague people, Czech people, how to use public space, how to use open space in Prague, how to use parks, how to use streets. Because before it, nobody couldn't imagine that it is possible to make picnic in park and to spend the whole day in park with friends and so on and so on. So now all people who lived there 10, 20 years ago are able to do it. And but what I find really a big value there is that they are still living, old people or people who live there really the whole their life, and they are owners of memories of these places. Yeah. For example, in our house, there are still maybe 3 old ladies who are able to explain who lived there 50 years ago and so on. I also, when I'm going through the street, I also could meet people who I met 30 years ago. So for me, that memory is maybe the biggest value in this part, and I think this is the thing which is necessary to protect this memory. Yeah, of people, not only the memory of the structure, physical structure of the houses. So I think that the city has to find some tools how to protect the possibility for these people to live there still.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Ferguson. You've been living in Berlin since 1990, as I learned.
Well, for me, when I hear this question about remembering the city or what experience of the city of the last 25 years, I have to say that Berlin was, for me, that there was a momentous moment. I mean, I'm half German. I had no intention of living in Germany. Then the wall fell, and I was actually called by television station to, knowing that I was bilingual, to come to Berlin. So I was actually in this absolutely surreal moment, age 21, standing at the Brandenburg Gate. And then, you know, in the ensuing months, basically being responsible for gathering loads of material with a French camera team based we were living in a hotel in East Berlin, in the Palace Hotel, which has now been demolished. And so my experience is like this, that there are distinct moments of incredibly compressed time that are incredible, and the first period was just phenomenally surreal because we were traveling constantly across Checkpoint Charlie with television material, and which would then be sent by satellite from West Berlin. But we were living in we were staying in East Berlin for endless weeks and months, covering the East German Parliament in the building, the Place der Republik. So filming as journalists. And experiencing almost, I can't even remember if we drove around with a map, but having to drive around to find the various sort of members of the dissident groups and interview former Stasi members of the secret police and try to make phone calls. I had to sort of spend hours trying to make phone calls in an empty sort of in an empty office right near Brandenburg Gate of the prefab building with just one phone in it and a desk and a chair, and basically dialing these numbers that I'd been given by random people to find various interviewees. So it was a very bizarre, surreal time to be in and very exciting. And then again, this compressed time, I mean, just to give an example of the Palais der Republik, we experienced the disbanding of the East German Parliament, then a few years later experienced the moment where, in fact, it had been decided that the Palais der Republik would be demolished as a symbol of basically an East German political symbol that was no longer wanted there. So we were filming and talking within the Place der Republik about the fate of this building as the architecture profession failed, in fact, to stop the demolition of this building because it was politically not wanted anymore. And then a few years later to see it stripped to a sort of to the sort of skeleton, and then to see the einstürzende Neubauten performing in there and using the sort of remains of the building as, you know, a drumming on the on this frame that was left, this skeleton of the building that was left. So I don't know. It's very hard to kind of talk about this in one moment, but I don't think I never thought I would experience the change in a city that's so rapid, and to be right at the very center where you are. 1 year after the next, there would be ground floor gallery spaces occupied by small, tiny spaces that were made available by someone in the local administration in Mitte to these gallerists who just started using the space for free. And to see now, you know, all these years later, the gallerists are like have top enterprises still running in Berlin, you know, and to see this sort of period of temporary use where every single building was implemented for this temporary use, even on Alexanderplatz, high-rises, Haus des Lehrers, Haus des Reisens, were occupied, and in some cases still are, for offices and for small-scale production teams living on very little money, and it enabled a whole kind of profession of creative scene to develop, and so that every bit of the city was implemented for a club or for a small enterprise or for a temporary fashion studio, and this has been going on and off for a number of years. So it's this feeling that every piece of the urban fabric was somehow, for a time, and still is to a certain extent, these leftover in-between spaces, or bits of the urban fabric, are available, you know, for use, for temporary use, for being implemented, for being transformed to a completely different purpose. And that in itself is something that happened incredibly fast, and there are very few people who've actually documented these moments. I mean, we were able to use, on the Karl Marx Allee, there is the Café Moscow, which is a huge space, and just by chance, because club culture had managed to get hold of this whole building, I was able to do a festival there in 2002, having actually been there, I don't know, 8 or 9 years before that, with a camera team in a completely empty restaurant where we were told to sit in a certain corner probably because we would be, we were still being what's the word, taped as we were, as foreigners, as a foreign camera team in Berlin. So it's these very, very surreal moments that are constantly recurring in your mind as you go through the city now. And in fact, where things were so fast that you also forget the corners of certain streets, how they used to look after certain buildings were demolished. Some more memorable than, but others, this speed at which things changed. You actually lost a sense of the previous building or the previous constellation of the city. Anyway, I mean, as you can see, it's very hard to sort of sum this up in a short statement.
Yeah, but I think we can tell from your very expressive and enthusiastic memories of that time that it was like a time of some unlimited freedom, maybe, in Berlin. Yeah, but let's go on to Jakob, who has experience actually from both Berlin and Prague. So
yeah, but I'm neither from Berlin or from Prague by birth. Like I'm also from a...
Jakob, can you speak into the microphone?
Hello? Yeah. So I'm also from a smaller town, also close to the French border, like very close to Freiburg in southern Germany. And but I had in Prague I had a grandma, so I was even when I was a small boy, I was in communist times. I was traveling here basically every year at least once, so I kind of knew the town. And I think I was still a bit too small to really explore the city on my own shortly after the revolution, but I somehow saw it at least changing very fast. And I think a lot of that we see now as this over tourist use, that I think the kind of the fundament of this was created pretty soon, is my feeling, that many of the places which are they are now much more overused, but I think the kind of this the starting of these processes, I think even the certain type of establishments, I have the feeling they were there very early after 1990, even though this zone somehow expanded. And the city of Prague really changed dramatically, because before it was, it wasn't so empty like Potsdamer Platz physically, there were buildings, but the emptiness, that there was basically very little really in the city. This was also the charm of the city, so this is gone of course. This was a kind of very specific atmosphere. And I moved to Berlin in 1998 when I think the most wildest days were over, but it was still a pretty crazy town, I think, especially for people from a small town coming to Berlin, because I think it was something like a complete opposite to the rest of Germany. We really saw it as such a kind of it was poor, the rest of Germany, or at least the west of Germany was kind of a pretty affluent place. It was, a lot of things were possible. I remember, for example, we were usually parties in the night, they started very late. We were students, so we could afford that. That we started maybe at midnight the party, and then it always ended on roofs of the buildings which were open in that time. It was quite open. In many buildings, it was possible. It was possible to just go on the roof and then basically to walk in Eastern Berlin on the roof, from along the whole block. It wasn't legal, but it was in a way it was possible, and we were doing that very often. There was all these spaces which were not so, they were maybe not totally illegal anymore, but they were still kind of squat-like or kind of legalized squats, a lot of very alternative places. And at the same time, when thinking of this Potsdamer Platz scene, this was also a period of huge construction, simply enormous size of construction. And in a way, this was very exciting, because it was just no one knew what will come out of this. Or we knew, we saw the plans, but it just looked so that the future is somehow built. And now sometimes, if I go to Potsdamer Platz, I'm really... this is completely gone, this atmosphere. It's just very, in a way, it's one of the rather boring parts of the city. But I remember then, because it was really like a huge zone, just construction and basically not accessible. You just saw the future is somehow growing there, that it was quite exciting. Yeah, like what happened or how the city, like I don't, like I think like now my relation to Berlin, because I left then Berlin sometimes in the mid 2000s. So I think I'm a bit nostalgic about this time. So I often think that now it's too touristic, for example, or that you cannot easily go to the roofs probably of buildings anymore, or not so easy as it used to be. And maybe I'm not really able to see all the like the kind of the new character of the city, because you're always a bit trapped in your own like memories of what you were doing there, and sometimes that's not possible anymore. Yeah, now I live here in Prague and discover Prague every day anew, and I think there's a lot, even though like if we're talking about the center, like this historical center, it's kind of, in my point of view, it's a very problematic zone. But if we think of the center as a larger zone, and I think we should think of the center as a larger zone, then I think it's actually very exciting, and there's even a lot of also good developments, like small-scale developments happening, like new kind of places opening. Unfortunately, also like a lot of very problematic type of development is simply like changing the city.
I would like to ask if it's necessary that like people are leaving the city centers in Berlin and Prague, and and what has changed in contrast to the situation in the 1990s. Anyone? Yeah, Ms.
I don't think that the first film was totally right, because there was a lot of places in the Czech Republic, in the cities, which were abandoned. The centers were abandoned as well. So it started with the massive Panelbauten, like in Germany. Yeah. So with the massive construction of new housing, there was also some, like, let's say, decreasing of the number of people living in the centers, or the centers were, in some cities, the centers were becoming ghettos. So to live in a center was not the first choice sometimes, because the newly built flats were, there was a hot water any time in the day. There was a heating any time of the day. So it was pretty hard to live in the center. So what we see here, it's maybe Prague is a little bit specific, because there was always lack of flats from the end of Second World War and even before. Yeah. So any flat was really worth, and that's the reason of the funny story you have seen. Yeah. So I don't think that there is, it was everything. There was really, there's a lot of cities. And even in Prague, there were some places, there was a proverb, if you seek a flat in Prague, avoid some parts of the city. Karlínu a Libni zdaleka se vyhni. Yeah. So there were parts of the cities which were not suited for, like, nice for living. What we have seen was a beautiful flat on the bank of the river. This was not an average flat. What we have seen in the film from Berlin is it was kind of another story maybe. So the people they stayed in the cities because they have to. In Prague, they just couldn't get another flat sometimes, and they were massively leaving the city center in the 90s. At least some of them, and other people moved into the center of the city. So there was this nice image in the heads of a lot of families in the 90s that they should have a nice family house at the outskirts of the city of Prague. And that was like the very important wish in their lives, to have a nice family house in the greenery on the outskirts of the city. And now we are facing another story, that the people are coming back. Yeah, so those families, they are coming back, and the people started to find out their ways, how to live inside the city. And that's also bringing maybe another ways of use. Yeah, so there is ask for much more greenery, also very near to the city center. The schools are once more filled in, because especially the schools in Prague 1, they were almost empty. Yeah, the primary schools, and now the families are coming back to the center. So this is what I find very important.
Well, thank you for the commentary. Well, what you were speaking about is this phenomenon of like suburbanization. But on the other hand, I just read some recent statistics, and actually the number of vacant apartments in the city center is actually growing. That would maybe counter your thesis, or
If we are speaking about Prague, there is a lot of empty apartments, but they are not empty because no one wants to live in them. They are empty because it doesn't bring the owners that much sense to rent them. Because under certain circumstances, they are not paid enough. So sometimes you can see here in the center of Prague empty houses, and they are empty because it's easy to rent just the shops in the first floor, maybe the second floor, and just to let the house like it is. Yeah. So this is the reason. This is not that no one wants to live there. There's a lot of people who would love to live in those houses, but this is a question of owners. We do have a lot of houses bought by Italian companies in the center of Prague, and they are empty. They're even really devastated. They are empty for dozens of years.
Yeah, well, thank you. Mrs. Melkova, would you maybe like to comment on this tendency of people returning back to the city centers? If you think, like, you're in the planning institute of the city of Prague, so if you can, confirm this.
Well, I think that me as a representative of the city, I have to think about how the city could help people not to leave centers and live there. I think that one tool, one of many tools, is, for example, keeping, protecting, supporting diversity of these parts of the city. And as I mentioned, Vinohrady, my place of life, this is the place where, and I think it's one of the best places in Prague. And there is everything. Our children are going there to the low school, middle school, high school. We have our studio 100 meters near their school. There is cinema, there is theater, there are offices, there is sport hall, everything, shops, restaurants. So, but for example, in the historic center, it doesn't function. This thing. There are not small shops here. I think only few schools and so on. So this is one of the ways. And on the other side, my main topic of work in last 2-3 years is public space, and what is also necessary is quality of public spaces, also in the center. But on the other side, we have a big problem when we want to revitalize public space or make new public space somewhere where people don't live, where they are only working, or where there are only officers or foreigners. It doesn't function because real public space, functional public space, need normal people who are living normal everyday life there, normal things, not only some amusing and attractions and Disneylands and so on and so on. So it's a circle. Yeah, the quality of public spaces, people who live there, and diversity of these parts. one tool of it, and there are necessary many other tools. But
yeah, I think we will get to this topic later. Maybe now Berlin, like this short movie was very critical. Would you like to react?
My department, especially my colleague, Ms. Schön, is in charge of these houses. It's a little bit complicated in Germany and in Berlin. I would like to mention in Berlin is special. We don't have a historic center. It was bombed away and it was demolished. We don't have large areas where every house is protected, and we have very large protected areas, but not from the medieval or Baroque times. And we also don't have a large business district. We are the only city in Western Europe or Central Europe where also the business district was bombed away and replaced in the east, it was in the east, replaced by public housing. That's one thing. The West Berlin Center was established in a former very fashionable upper class housing areas, and so we never had the concentration of offices and retail there. We have a very good mixture. And the socialist program in the East was to replace the capitalistic city and the historic city by housing areas. Some 100 meters around the television center, the symbolic center of the city of Berlin owns every apartment. We are a city where people rent. We don't own our apartments. That's also very special. And we have a special German situation. After World War I, for 3 generations, public housing was the major topic in German politics. Because the catastrophes of 2 world wars, we have legal and administrative instruments for the complete control of the housing market, and we had that in West Berlin till 1989, and we introduced that in East Berlin after 1989 for 10-50 years. But then, for the first time since World War I, we had not only no more housing shortage, we had 100,000 empty apartments everywhere in the city, declining population, and at that time private owners went to the courts, and the courts told us, forget all your steering and legal instruments to protect the owners of such houses. And in this case, these people have the privilege to live. They started to live at the wall in the death zone. That were people, very privileged people from East Germany, like Katharina Witt, very prominent people lived there. It was an upper class. It was an upper class residential area because it was so close to the wall. Only people who had no problems to accept the daily control of the frontier troops in front of their house lived there. Later it changed a little bit, and the city, and they live next to Brandenburger Tor, Brandenburg Gate, and next to Potsdamer Platz. And so when the city of Berlin had to decide in its moment of ruin of 2001, which apartments to sell first, it was these apartments. And anyway, our colleagues of that time tried to protect these, physically, these buildings. We started a planning law process and wanted to fix these houses in the planning law. But we also didn't succeed in the court. The court told us German national planning law is not meant to preserve these houses and to protect these people in a time when you have 100,000 empty apartments in Berlin. And the new owners, of course, started to bring tourists they look on Brandenburg Gate, they look on Potsdamer Platz and Tiergarten. And 2 years ago, we got a new legislation that is forbidding renting private apartments to tourists. And now all these instruments we have in Germany for generations to protect the tenants of such apartments are re-established. But in the time of the crisis, we reduced the staff in our administration from 200,000 to 100,000. There is no person left to control the misuse of apartments. And so we are we have a schizophrenia. We are number 3 in European urban tourism. We want to become number 1. At the moment, that's Paris. And we don't want to bring the tourists in our inner city apartments. And that's not so easy to reach both. And we have that's another story. We started, our colleagues in the tourist department started a special tourism acceptance program because the most influential urban development scheme is the plan in Berlin. Is the plan that tourists get at their hotel desk, and there they indicate the interesting street. And every street that is indicated in this touristic map is changed completely in 1 or 2 years. There is no more shop for local people, only bars and restaurants. And so maybe we need influence on the mapping of the tourist industry. And we have to bring the tourists to strange places, former wall strips in the periphery, Olympic stadiums, given up airports, and we have a lot of miracles that are very good connected to the hotspots of inner city tourism, but that's quite a challenge. We need the money. We are a city without industry. We are, in 2001, we were a completely ruined city. The tourism is one of the major businesses in Berlin, and we have to cope with these challenges.
Thank you. That's a very interesting proposal, mapping the tourism routes. Well, would Jakob or Mrs. Ferguson like to react to the Berlin?
Maybe just a short comment. I think like some of these developments, they are really like, even though the cities are so different, they're actually quite similar developments and similar challenges. Like I noticed, for example, already many years ago that in Žižkov, that many houses were actually transformed into like tenement houses, were transformed into hostels, and probably also in other boroughs of Prague. But I think that here it was like hardly ever really questioned. Like I think this like whole process of touristification, because it started like early in the 90s, and also because the center was in a way pretty empty. Like there weren't so many functions in the city. Maybe not even there were people living there, but also many people made money by moving out in a way. So it wasn't only like kind of brutal force, but also this gentrification also offered for many people in a way opportunities, like to make some money by just offering their flat. So when I came from Berlin then to Prague, I was really surprised by this absence of any discussion at that time, like on for example tourism, but also on these like major decisions to sell huge huge city property to private developers without. I mean, there was some expert discussion, but basically in the media, it was just like basically just a notice, or it was just very. It wasn't like systematically explored, which changed a lot, I think, in recent years. But also because of this like absence of discussion, I think a lot of unnecessary damage was done. Yeah.
Well. Since I returned to Berlin after a phase of being in Switzerland and went back with a child looking for a flat and ended up in Prenzlauer Berg, which is a very particular demographic, I suppose. A lot of families, a lot of kids, very middle class, very white middle class. I find it interesting to be in an area that's now a sort of tourist hotspot as well, because it's right near the Mauerpark and the former strip of the Berlin Wall. I think I'm a bit of a pragmatist when it comes to these processes of gentrification, because I think the sort of the level at which one can live still in the center of Berlin, at the cost of which one can still rent a place in the center of Berlin, one has to put that in relation to other large-scale cities, and there is a reason why people are moving from extremely high-cost cities like London and Paris to Berlin, because they realize there is a quality of life to be had, and the rents were extremely low. They are obviously rising, and there is a cap on rent on the rising rents now. What I do find interesting, though, is to see there is a process of change, which is pretty much normal in a city that's developing so rapidly and where the population is growing so rapidly. In the whole area where I live, we know exactly where there are these Airbnb hostels and apartments. I think it's fascinating to see the sort of the subtle shifts, though, where in an area where there is a shift from rental to ownership, where there's more and more of a younger generation, quite a conservative young generation, having flats financed in this area of Prenzlauer Berg. And particularly where I'm living, there's a very unusual situation that you had a back courtyard that was shared by two large-scale apartments, where there was this moment for 2.5 years of a certain neighborly situation, which was extremely unusual, because we had a whole mix of residents, from single mothers to quite sort of punky people to older generation, and everyone would meet in the back garden, and there would be this shared space that was a kind of quite a rough back courtyard shared by two buildings. And what naturally happened as part of this gentrification, well, naturally, irritatingly happened, is that the owner of one of the buildings is now putting a maisonette, a 2-floor maisonette, quite chic building right in the middle of this garden. So it's densification, there's no space for us left. The single mother next door has been told she must move because the owner wants to live in her floor, and the roof will be developed. And also one sees these subtle shifts in attitude when it comes to ownership versus those who are renting their spaces. There's a very large area, a green area, one of the four shared inner courtyards just behind our building, which was also a place where a certain scene would always meet, and it was an absolutely mixed and extraordinary scene. And I experienced this because of the families and the kids that I knew there. And there were no fences, and it was and it's a piece of property, the Hirschhof, that's been sort of that I believe the local government and the Senat has always wanted to sort of turn into a park or turn into something, and somehow it's over years and decades this plot of land has remained within this kind of like an inner oasis that you can't really get to from the street, and but gradually the change with new ownership of one of the buildings, another maisonette flat that's just been built there, you had a sort of a magical interior garden where everyone would meet, and now gradually, the fence is put up, and the owners of the maisonette flat are sort of then, the garden is getting a different feel, it's being cultivated in a different way, in a completely different style, and the sort of punky neighbors are no longer going there, and what's the word? A fence has been built. And this whole kind of moment of neighborliness, of unusual mix of residents has given way somehow because of an attitude from those who actually own their building versus those who are still occupying a building or living very cheap rents. It's incredible to see this transformation. I do think ownership our architects will talk about this endlessly, about when they are part of a Baugruppe and they have to design apartments, and they get together in a group of co-owners of a building, and there's an architect responsible for designing the interiors of the whole building, said how the people that they knew completely often transform into these kind of demanding sort of monsters, obsessed about details, because they own the place now. And so they have completely different levels of taste and demands and pressures that they put on an architect and on their own lives as well. So I think that the privilege of a city like Berlin is that it's still by and large a place where you can rent, but there is this encroaching sense of the new sort of these owners of apartments that have a completely different sort of sense of their place, and also demands on their neighborhood, which are not exactly always open or generous as it might have been previously.
If I can just a short reaction. It reminds me to the Bible, where it's written what they are doing by the rivers of Babylon. So the cities were always dangerous from the beginning of the life. The cities were dangerous. At the same time, they were very interesting. There was a danger. There was always a modernity. There was always a new life born. And there was always a maybe old life dying in the city. There was always something disappearing, and there was always something new born. And what we have seen is nothing new. There is a book from 19th century about a young student who came to Prague, died finally, killed by the wild city of Prague. Yeah. So I don't know. I think that the cities can be dangerous. The cities can be not understood by some, but they are a wonderful opportunity, maybe.
I live around the corner of this sound club. It was the first place I went when I visited first time Berlin in 1976, because our youth guest house was in front of it, and we were forbidden to go there. And this club doesn't exist anymore, and there stood the house where Walter Benjamin was born, who then moved one street further in my apartment, and then his family moved on and on. And danger is a very interesting thing, but you can do a lot with such stories. This Children of Bahnhof Zoo movie was had a very high impact in urban planning in Germany, because since that time nobody accepted large housing estates in the periphery in West Germany anymore, because everybody learned from this movie and the story. Young people who live in the periphery, who don't live in bourgeois families in the center or in the green areas, have no chance. They will be drug addicts. And the wall had to come down for us West Germans to learn that large housing estates can be the home of middle-class people in the East, in socialist countries. And it was a very, very long process to get acceptance again for West Berliners and West German people, dealing with these remainings of the housing policy, post-war housing policy in East and West. And so the adventure is something very attractive, and it's very difficult which story you tell and whom or what kind of urban structure do you blame in your movie or in your novel.
Thank you. And now I would like to ask if there are any questions from the public. Yeah. Yes, klar. No, we need the audio.
Hi. I would like to ask in the round, so anybody is free to answer. If you could draw an imaginary economic topography of the different countries, not different countries, the two different cities, how would they differ or be equal with each other? And I would like to put emphasis on the periphery, if you feel free.
Try to start. For us in Berlin, it's a question, what is periphery? It starts in the heart of the city because you have these prefabricated large-scale buildings in the historic center. For us, a city like Prague is a fairy tale and something very strange because we don't have these clear structures and we don't have this antagonism between the inner city and the periphery. And for us, it's always a question, how can you revitalize a disappeared inner city, even if you have gentrification there, and how can you maintain and revitalize these typical structures of periphery you have in the inner city and in the outskirts, to give people an idea and a strategy in the boroughs, in the real estate market, then we need the periphery. If we don't succeed to make the periphery attractive and livable and closely connected in minds and in infrastructure to the inner city, then we don't have the chance to maintain a little bit normal everyday life in the heart of the city. And then we also, every city has the danger that you have the center that's only for tourists and for people with too much money and to people who want entertainment and something like that. And so we are also very focused on the developing of the inner city, but the periphery, that's the interesting part, the most interesting and the decisive part of the urban development.
I think this periphery is moving. Once in the 19th century, the periphery was the place where my colleague is now living. And actually, it was the most successful development in Prague ever. This part of Prague too, it was built in a pretty short period of time by like say upper middle class for upper middle class those days, and that was like very successful story. And if we are speaking about periphery, you could consider some parts of inner Prague as an inner periphery, because if you are speaking about structures, it's almost perfect. But when we are speaking about life in those structures, it's really another story. So there is a physical structure, and there is a mental space, or there is a life, there is an action. And not necessarily those two parts of the city are in equilibrium. Sometimes there is a beautiful structure and almost no life, and sometimes there is a really up to wide life or very livable area with let's say less beautiful structure, or it can be a structure which is changing a lot. Yeah, it can look like a direct one. It's partly what you said about. So we do have a parts of Prague, like some parts of Prague 7, where we are from, which are changing every day, and it's a beautiful story to see it. Although we are also facing a change in inhabitants. So the people who can afford, because let's say the prices are increasing there, because it's a nice part of the city. So another people are moving in, and there is a question what we can do for the people still living there for a lot of years, that they can stay. So how to achieve this equilibrium in the city, that also the people who are already living in those parts of the city which are changing, that they can stay there. So that the gentrification has certain limits. We couldn't stop the gentrification, it's not possible. But how to make it that, how to put some certain limits to the gentrification and what the cities can do for it.
Maybe short comment. I think we should be very careful with using this term periphery, because especially in Czech, it has a little bit negative connotations. And my experience is that when we talk with people who live there, and we want to change something, and our starting point is everything is wrong in their periphery, especially real estate. But it's their home, and these people like this place, and they don't like when we say it's periphery and everything is wrong. So it's a little bit sensitive term, this periphery. It's my experience for the people.
I think for me, in relation to Berlin, I think the extraordinary thing about the city of Berlin is that it is so polycentric, that you have these districts, these Kiez, this so-called Kiez, different areas inside the S-Bahn ring and outside the S-Bahn ring where you discover completely different sort of feelings and styles of neighborhood and life, where you can find, I don't know, down in the southern part of Berlin, you can find areas that look like a small West German town, and that this is a process of permanent discovery of very specific localized centers to which people feel very linked to over many years and very settled to, and there are loyalties there too, and I think this notion of identification with a place is so crucial, especially at a time when in Berlin you have pretty much every district is now up for grabs and development. I mean, the latest cover on the City magazine was Lichtenberg, I Love Lichtenberg, the new heart of Berlin, which was always considered to be on the edge, very much on the outer edge of the city. And I think the interesting thing for any developer or any architect is absolutely local specificity and identification with a very local place, and to kind of draw something from that. And I think that makes for quite a fragmented sense of Berlin identity, which is a good thing too, and very locally specific. And that's something one can strengthen, I think, in the next phases of development.
And then there's also the question of the real periphery, in the sense of what is outside of the city. And even though there's this trend of people moving back to the city, and maybe that to some extent that maybe the population in the city is growing possibly a bit faster now than in the outskirts. I think there's still, or in the suburbia, that there's still a huge boom happening outside. And in the case of Prague, or in the case of Central Bohemia, it's not coordinated at all. Like all our attempts of strategic planning, it's basically just really what is in the city. And I think in the case of Berlin, there were more attempts to kind of regulate it in a way, to along the railway lines, for example, to have like a kind of these booming places to have a certain order in that, and I think this is like one of the biggest losses and one of the biggest failures, basically, because also what is the periphery as an ecological asset, it's pretty much damaged in the case of Prague.
Are there more questions?
I would like to ask a question about diversity and those two cities. As we often say that urbanicity and diversity is a very is a synonym of each other. I would like to ask if there is a relationship between a city and, for example, its hospitability. For example, like today, obviously the refugees issue or question, actually. Berlin reacts very differently than Prague. And I would like to know if you draw parallels. The both cities have very different histories, I know. Berlin, obviously, is probably had a lot of changes. It was damaged. And so Prague, maybe we were talking about the museification of a city. Do you think there's a relation between the city, the actual like morphology of a city, and the public opinion that someone would have of change or of difference?
I think it's a little bit newspaper picture, because we don't have a lot of refugees coming through the Czech Republic, so I don't think we can describe an attitude to the public towards refugees from the. We can't read it from the morphology. I don't think it's so. I think there. What is in Prague? If you ask me, what is the city doing for the refugees? For example, in Prague 7, there are possibilities prepared. So we are waiting some group of refugees, and we have prepared the schools and flats and everything. So it's prepared. The only problem is that there are almost no refugees who wants to stay. And this is not the fault of the people of Prague. This is a part of politics. So that there is a, for me, very strange attitude to the refugees, which is going from the bigger politics. But there are centers who are preparing things for refugees. So the people acting individually, they are making groups, they are traveling in a mass. Probably we can say in the mass to Croatia and to Hungary and to the countries to help there. Yeah. So even if the city official is not making a much, then the people are organizing themselves and they are making things. And maybe it's a kind of new phenomenon in Prague that the people are now realizing that what's very important is to have your personal attitude to your surrounding, and they start to form groups. They are meeting, they are organizing things for themselves, even if it was a little bit complicated after the Velvet Revolution, because to be a member of some organization was your duty. So after the revolution, the people were a little bit reserved, let's say, to make things together, because they were used to be like from a duty to part of some I don't know, pioneer or whatever. And now I think that there is a huge generation change. That the people who start to be stakeholders in their communities, or they start to organize things, they are not thinking that way anymore. So therefore, you will find people who just starting to organize things, and they are really mature. They are able to find even support. They are able to find funding themselves. So they are not always asking a city for support, sometimes, and sometimes also not.
I would also like to comment it. Also in Germany, immigration is a great challenge for every generation. After the war, we had millions of German people who came to West and East Germany. We have a very strong tradition for immigration, but we had a lot of problems with the people from Southern Europe and especially from Turkey, who came to Germany and to Berlin, and we were not prepared to make them real citizens. They were neighbors, not citizens. And that's also a big difference between former West Berlin and East Berlin, because before 1989 we had an extremely amount of national funding for the refurbishment of the inner city quarters, and all the unemployed migration people could move there in very, very nice 19th century quarters and houses, and they lived there. And we didn't have that in the East, because the city with the national money only funded the technical infrastructure, the public spaces, and the renovation of the houses was mostly paid by private people. And so I never would, as a socialized West Berliner, I would never move to Prenzlauer Berg or Mitte or Lichtenberg. I would miss my Turkish, Russian, Arabian neighbors. You have special shops, you have special restaurants, you have this difference in Berlin. And at the moment, we have a very special situation, maybe even a dramatic situation in Germany. Germany is the country when almost every day a home for refugees is burnt down. And that's so alarming that civil society in Germany wants to prove that's not us. And that's the reason why I think why the people were so welcoming in Munich, and people are so welcoming also in Berlin. We have a complete chaotic situation. In the 1990s, we had years where 400,000 refugees came to Germany, mostly from former Yugoslavia, and then German politics succeeded to reduce the number of refugees to 40,000 in the last years, and we gave up all our infrastructure, our administrative infrastructure, to welcome and to integrate these people. And now most of these refugees are welcomed, they are fed, and they are supported by private middle-class people who want to prove that the German civil society is strong enough, and we have modern tools in the internet and something like that. We can organize it. Our city government is not able. We have a lot of volunteers in the administration to try to end the chaos, the chaotic situation, and it's a very strong conflict where you have to draw a line and tell yourself and the foreign people we cannot handle it anymore, we cannot manage it anymore, and so I think the question is civil society in Germany and especially in Berlin strong enough to welcome 1 million people in 1 year. I think we will succeed, but it's a very profound challenge and a very profound conflict, because we have a lot of people who want to burn down the homes of these refugees, and you can imagine what that means in the background of German history.
Just a short remark. Czech Republic welcomed around 15,000 refugees from former Yugoslavia in the time of the war, and nothing happened, nothing special. So it's a kind of strange story that we are now really afraid about to take some 1,500 what we've promised. Yeah, so it's really strange for me, but that was something kind of natural that happened. And we've also welcomed kind of some thousands people, so thousands people from Vietnam, and nothing happened. So it's I have seen once a map of Europe, and the people were mostly afraid in the parts of Europe where they have almost no refugees. So they were mostly afraid of refugees where there were no of them.